statements, increased reporting requirements and multinational anti-tax avoidance measures. Expanding the definition will defeat attempts to restructure corporations to avoid the multinational tax avoidance. This was multinational tax avoidance laws which were introduced by Labor when we were in government. It's a sensible measure, as I've already said, but according to the government, it won't do anything to close the enormous multinational tax gap. This goes to the heart of the second reading amendment which I move. The explanatory memorandum notes that the revenue impact of this measure is estimated at nil. The multinational tax gap was estimated at more than $2 billion by the Australian Tax Office, when last publicly estimated in 2016-17. Well, we questioned that estimate back in 2016-17, and a lot of water has passed under the bridge since then. That's likely to be a very conservative estimate. Other estimates put the estimate at closer to $13 billion. I'm sure members in this place would agree, whether it's $2 billion or $13 billion, it's tax owed, and it's tax that should be paid, because that money can better be put to use in this country, improving our infrastructure, improving our school education system, improving our university education system, our vocational education system, our hospitals and healthcare, improving the quality and the availability of pharmaceuticals in this country, Deputy Speaker. I'm sure all honourable members of this place would agree that that is a much better use of that money. Whether it's $2 billion or $13 billion, as more reliable estimates put it, that's money that should be paid, and it's money should be put to work by this parliament. Company after company has been exposed as paying zero tax on their Australian operations, including large companies, as I've mentioned in the previous debate, such as Goldman Sachs, Shell and IBM. Deputy Speaker, under the previous governments and under this government, 1/3 of all large companies paid no income tax whatsoever. It's extraordinary and worth repeating. 1/3 of all large companies paid no income tax whatsoever. Data issued by the Australian Tax Office in December last year showed that out of 2,214 large companies, as many as 710 of them paid no tax whatsoever in 2017-18. That number includes 102 firms reporting more than $1 billion in total revenue. Now, I want you to contrast that picture to the picture of an average Australian worker. A single Australian worker pays 25% of their income in taxes. However, these large companies earning over $1 billion average tax payments of only 2% of income. I want you to think about that for a moment. One earns $1 billion, another one is earning an average income of under $80,000 a year, one paying no income tax, or an average of 2% of their income, the other, Deputy Speaker, paying 25% of their income. It's not fair, it's inequitous, and more needs to be done about it. Yeah. And the only reason that we know about the scope of this tax avoidance is because of Labor's tax transparency laws, which, I hasten to point out, the coalition members voted against. Is there any wonder why they didn't want to bring this debate on today? Because there is significant embarrassment for government members. The tax transparency laws, which enable us to identify the extent of tax avoidance, were opposed by this mob opposite. So when they get up and speak in this debate about their commitment to doing something about multinational tax avoidance, I want them to remember the ignominy and the shame of the fact that they voted against Labor's tax transparency measures, and they would still rather avoid the spotlight. They released this report through gritted teeth every single year in the doldrum days of December, after the press gallery has gone home for their Christmas holidays. The coalition wants you to think that they're tough on tax avoidance, but nothing could be further from the truth. That's why they spent $24 million last financial year on an advertising campaign promoting tax integrity and their so-called tax avoidance task force. Remember that number, $24 million promoting a tax avoidance task force. This task force, when it was announced as a budget measure back in 2016, but it's simply not true. Like so much that this government does, they've got a plan for everything, but they follow through on nothing. When you peel back the detail, what you discover is that it is all marketing and deception. As the Audit Office has recently revealed, there is no tax avoidance task force. It was a blatant untruth. The Treasurer knows it, the Prime Minister knows it. They're trying to hoodwink the Australian taxpayers. They're trying to hoodwink their own backbench that they're somehow serious about this issue of anti-tax avoidance. $25 million on an advertising campaign. Doesn't that tell you everything about this Prime Minister? It tells you everything you need to know about this Prime Minister. It's about coffee cups and T-shirts saying "Back in Black." It's about a $25 million anti-tax avoidance advertising campaign. But when it comes to doing something about tax avoidance, missing in action. And that's why they wanted to delay this debate, because they were embarrassed. It takes a lot to embarrass this mob over here, but they were embarrassed about the fact that they promoted an anti-avoidance tax avoidance task force that simply did not exist. There was no consistent methodology for assigning tax avoidance resources and no actual tax avoidance task force. There was no actual task force unit within the tax office, Deputy Speaker. The Prime Minister has been caught out with a red-hot deception once again. Indeed, the ATO's methodology for assigning resources was so convoluted that the Auditor-General could not confirm whether resourcing was supplied in line with the budget estimates. So not only was their advertising campaign completely misleading and untrue, but the way that they arranged resources within the tax office themselves, it appears, was designed to mislead and untruth as well. Funding may have been used to cover up real cuts to baseline staff in affected areas. So not only are they not allocating resources as they said they were going to do in the budget papers, but it appears that they've actually cut resources. They've actually taken staffing resources out of the anti-tax avoidance area. Is it any wonder that this mob do not want to talk about this issue today? Money spent on ad campaigns to promote actions that simply aren't happening. This is something that the hollow men would be proud of. This farcical approach of this government to multinational tax avoidance shouldn't surprise anybody. In fact, this is exactly how the Morrison government generally responds to most of its problems. It goes something like this. Step 1, ignore the problem. Call it a Labor conspiracy. Step 2, when the public pressure mounts, finally claim that you're responding to the problem while actually doing nothing at all. Step 3, spend taxpayer money on a high-concept ad campaign promoting your non-response to the problem. This is their gameplay on so many issues. They've got a plan for an advertising campaign that advertises the fact that they're doing absolutely nothing. And I'm sure that those government backbenchers who are lined up to speak after me will be happy to supply the last and the final step, ignoring the problem and then spending taxpayer money on an advertising campaign. Sorry, I said there were 3 steps. There's actually 4. When it all goes pear-shaped, blame Labor. Blame Labor, Deputy Speaker. Well, the Australian people deserve better than the absolute sideshow of this full carnival, Deputy Speaker. The Treasurer, the Prime Minister should spend less time on ad campaigns and more time ensuring big companies pay their fair share of tax. A small change to an obscure definition in the Income Tax Assessment Acts might be a sensible move. Labor backs the measure, but we don't back the government, and our money's not on the government's willingness to do anything about this $13 billion problem. Can I make some comments about Schedule 2? superannuation and fund mergers. Schedule 2 will make superannuation fund mergers simpler in the future. It does this by extending tax relief measures that were first introduced by Labor in 2008 to remove unnecessary impediments that would otherwise apply to fund mergers. I will always be in favour of any measures that helps to ensure better returns for fund members. Smaller and underperforming funds, whatever sector, whether they're in the retail sector or the industry sector, smaller and underperforming funds cannot be tolerated. Merging achieves better performance for members when they simply cannot achieve those returns in their current state. The now permanent tax relief measures will allow super funds to transfer revenue and capital losses to a new merged fund and to defer taxation consequences on gains and losses from revenue and capital assets. This sensible Labor reform has proved effective in giving fund trustees certainty when planning merger activity. In fact, just today, Deputy Speaker, two industry funds, or two funds in Queensland, together with two funds in Western Australia, I'm advised, have announced their intention to merge, Deputy Speaker. This sensible reform will ensure that their members aren't hit with an unintended tax burden on either capital gains or the ability to distribute capital losses, Deputy Speaker, on the merger of those funds. It makes sense. It's in the interests of members. We support it. Every Australian deserves to retire with dignity and independence, and Labor will always fight to make a stronger and fairer superannuation system as a result of this reform. The Productivity Commission recommended making it permanent, and the government has finally agreed. Deputy Speaker, I'd like to now formally move my second reading amendment. It calls on the government to commit to the legislated increase of superannuation guarantee to 12%.
Hear, hear.
And I welcome the fact that the member for Goldstein and the member for Mackellar are in the chamber today, because they're going to have the opportunity. You always know when they're in the chamber because the volume goes up but the sense goes down. The volume goes up but the sense goes down. So they are going to have the opportunity to vote in favour of the policy that they took to the last election by voting in favour of my second reading amendment. And the test will be on them. Will they confirm the promise that they made to the Australian people not 6 months ago by voting in favour of the legislated increases in superannuation to ordinary Australian workers, or will they vote against it? We offer them this opportunity today. It's because, Deputy Speaker, we think it's important that if promises are made that they're actually on it. We think that's important. We think that's important.
You don't understand the concept, do you?
It's always good to hear from the member for Mackellar. You know, it's always good to hear from. It's been a big puzzle for me for most of this week, Deputy Speaker, why there's been a rush on toilet paper, but the member for Mackellar, with his contributions, makes it perfectly clear today. Deputy Speaker.
Order. The member might like to refer to members by their correct titles. I think you're referring to the member for Goldstein.
I withdraw that, Deputy Speaker. And when I am devoid of a collective noun to refer to. When I am devoid of a collective noun to refer to these two clowns over here, Deputy Speaker, I have to defer to your ruling.
The member for Goldstein will resume his seat. He's made his point. He is correct. I was trying to correct the member on the technicality in that I think the member was referring to the member for Goldstein, who had been interjecting, not in terms of the substance of what the member for Whitlam had said. Having said that, I'd like to remind the member for Mackellar that he may not interject while he is not in his seat. The member for Whitlam will continue.
I thank the Deputy Chair for your guidance. And as I was saying, because the parliamentary procedures do not have a collective noun, common language does, and common usage has a collective noun to refer to the member for Mackellar and the member for Goldstein. But I rather suspect but I rather suspect, Deputy Speaker,
All right, order. The member has made his point, and the member for Whitlam will continue.
Speaker. He's been very keen to speak during my allotted time, Deputy Speaker. I look forward to hearing what the member for Goldstein has to say in this debate, Deputy Speaker. But I'm more interested in not so much what he has to say, but how he votes. Because you can say a lot of things in this place, but it's how you vote that matters.
How you exercise the freedom.
The freedom to vote,
conscience.
Deputy Speaker. And there are lots of Australians who are very keen to ensure that these two that have had a lot to say, Deputy Speaker, about superannuation and the promise that they made and their desire to renege on the promise that they made to the Australian people not 6 months ago when it comes to superannuation guarantee legislation, Deputy Speaker. Very keen to hear what they've got to say, very keen to see how they vote on my second reading amendment. I commend the legislation and the amendment to the House.
I thank the member for Whitlam for his contribution. Is the amendment seconded? And I call the member for Scullin.
Thank you, Deputy Speaker. I'm very pleased to second the amendment, and I reserve my right to speak.
I thank the member for Scullin. The original question was that this bill be now read a second time. To this, the honourable member for Whitlam has moved as an amendment that all words after that be omitted with a view to substituting other words. The question now is that the amendment be agreed to, and I call the member for Goldstein.
Thank you, Deputy Speaker. Deputy Speaker, that was the most insufferable few minutes I have ever experienced in my life from the member for Whitlam. And that's a surprise because we've had other members like the member for Holtz who have also extolled themselves in the chamber as the member for Fraser, amongst others. Because in the end, this bill comes down to a simple proposition. Without the amendment, it goes to the point of integrity or tax integrity, about the idea that we're going to have a tax system where people who have obligations are going to meet them and whether they're not. And we're in favour of doing that. We're in favour of making sure people can do that, making sure corporations can do that, but also making sure that we provide appropriate relief in the circumstances for superannuation funds. But in saying that, I do understand when the conception of tax integrity or integrity period is difficult for the member for Whitlam, because he has the same... thank you, Deputy Speaker. I'm done.
Will resume his seat. The member for Scullin.
Thank you, Deputy Speaker. He should not be reflecting on a member.
I thank the member for Scullin. It would assist the House if the member for Goldstein will withdraw and continue.
Deputy Speaker, for the sake of... I shall withdraw. I shall withdraw.
The member for Goldstein in continuation.
I will continue on my reflections on the legislation and raise my general concerns about the integrity of the system and the integrity of those people who espouse it, and the integrity in the situation where we might have particular people who have complete disregard for tax integrity for this country. And there are, of course, some people inside this and outside this place who have little regard for the expenditure of public money and how it is spent. And so I welcome the opportunity, at least because it seems that the member for Whitlam, in his address, still has not come to terms with the basic reality of the extent of multinational tax avoidance. In fact, he started from the very proposition for the member for McKellar, who got up directly and challenged the fact that he was claiming that $13 billion was foregone revenue when in fact it was only $2 billion. That can only happen in a situation where they have no or little interest in the facts of the matter and in the legislation at hand. The basis of our support for this legislation is simple, because we want to make sure that super funds can merge appropriately and in the best interests of their members. It's an entirely legitimate objective and one that we should support on the basis of integrity, but also to make sure that super funds can act where they see fit through consolidation. It's also about making sure that we have significant global entities meeting and honouring their obligations to the Australian taxpayer. Because the reality is, when you have a tax system which has leakage or opportunities where people are able to forego their responsibilities, then somebody else has to pick up the burden, and it falls on the Australian taxpayer to carry the costs of society. Everybody must share in that responsibility, and that is the basis in which I support this legislation, but not the show-ponying of the opposition in their amendments to the legislation. Thank you, Deputy Speaker.
I thank the member for Goldstein for his contribution. The question now is that the amendment be agreed to, and I call the member for Fraser.
Thank you, Deputy Speaker. I rise today to speak in favour of the amendment, and I very much hope that those opposite vote in line with that amendment, in line with the stated position that they took to the last election, and in line with the stated position of the Prime Minister, the Treasurer and many others opposite who have spoken in favour of taking superannuation to 12%, a much-needed reform. But I'm going to make a few observations today in relation to the parts of this bill that relate to multinational taxation and echo the sentiments that the Shadow Assistant Treasurer has just outlined. In particular, what I wish to echo is that we don't oppose the content of this bill, but as with so much that we face in this chamber, it is a step in the right direction, but a tiny step, a tiny shuffle in the right direction, but at the same time a wholly inadequate and unambitious and uncreative response to what are very serious problems. What we are dealing with in this instance is one of the great challenges to our taxation system, and yet what we're faced with is a bill that changes the definition, when what we should be debating in this place are deep, structural, long-term changes to our tax system that make our tax system more sustainable. When one looks at this issue, one can see dozens of countries around the world trying to deal with this issue simultaneously. The OECD has a base erosion and profit-sharing policy program in which over 100 countries have signed up to a very wide-ranging, large-scale policy set of initiatives. The reason being that on some estimates, something in the order of $240 billion of the tax base of OECD countries is currently under threat from profit shifting. Now, as the Shadow Assistant Treasurer outlined, there are far too many major companies in this country who are paying little or no tax. And for good reason, people in our community are outraged. They're seeing their own personal income tax rise year on, year out. They're seeing their own capacity to pay the bills under pressure, and yet they see in the media company after company paying little or no tax. Now, I just want to spend a couple of minutes running through why it is this is happening and why there is urgency to this issue. A lot of this, I believe, comes down to fundamental changes in the global economy. When one goes back to international trade theory, for example, in the 18th century, Ricardian tax theory, Heckscher-Rollin, it was a world where people imagined that we had some economies focusing on advanced goods and some economies focusing on resources and inputs, and most trade was between those kinds of economies. Most trade was between countries that were focused on producing the inputs to production processes and that they would then import back advanced manufactured goods. The vast majority of trade theory in the initial decades of economics was focused on that kind of thinking. And that was actually useful and did describe large parts of the world economy for a long period of time. Fast forward to the post-World War II era, and one can look at someone like Paul Krugman, who won the Nobel Prize for Economics for very deep insights into a changing world. What he found was that much of the world's trade post-World War II was actually shifting from what one might consider north-south trade to trade between OECD countries. There was very highly specialised trade between countries of very similar products. So his trade model, which was very different to the economics of the first 2 centuries of the discipline, looked at, for example, hyper-specialisation in the automotive industry, where there was massive trade in cars between Japan and Europe and the United States. And Krugman hypothesised that this was driven by consumers' demand for a variety of goods. One can, for example, look at the fact that the French specialised through the company Valeo in air conditioning for passenger cars, whereas the Germans specialised in air conditioning for buses. Now, fast forward yet again, and I believe the world economy is now going through as fundamental a change of that, if not more fundamental, where instead of just specialisation between advanced economies, what we are moving to now is a world where we are seeing competition not between companies based in advanced economies, but between global value chains. And so what we're seeing now, for example, is that Honda is partnering with parts producers in Vietnam, and BMW is partnering with parts producers in India. If one looks at the period 1988 to 1998, and what is often referred to as the I-6, which is China, India, Korea, Poland, Indonesia and Thailand, what we see is that the growth in completed goods exports, so motorcycles and cars, the growth in exports of those types grew, but not very much. But the growth in parts and components grew more than tenfold. And those parts and those components were often being exported to advanced economies, economies like Japan and the United States and Western Europe. The point being that we have moved to a different kind of global economy. We've moved to an economy where we shouldn't think of companies as being based in one country. Companies are now global entities, and they can shift their profits from any country to any other country. We are in the middle of this transformation. And the reason why this is so fundamental is that this is one of the key drivers of the erosion of advanced economy tax bases. Another related change that's going on in our economies is technological change which is allowing production to occur in any country through 3D printing, or services to be provided far from where the person is with the expertise. So, for example, we can see all sorts of services in the health sector provided by people in other countries. So Indian experts providing diagnostic services to people in Australia or the United States or Europe. So all of these technological changes are leading to great productivity growth, but they are also leading to opportunities for these multinational companies, multinational agglomerations, to shift profits. And it is happening. It is happening now, and it is growing. And so this is an example of an issue which the OECD recognises is a first-order issue. Something in the order of $240 billion, up to $240 billion, is under threat in the OECD tax base, and that is growing. And what do we have from the government? A bill that changes a definition. So that is really what we are challenging here today. It is a step in the right direction, but this is not what we should be doing after 7 years of this government. It's simply not good enough that this government is bringing in this policy area something so wholly inadequate. But as the Shadow Assistant Treasurer alluded to in the procedural debate earlier, it's not just this bill, it is bill after bill after bill that we end up supporting, but as a step in the right direction that is wholly inadequate. In policy area after policy area after policy area, the debates that we are engaged in this place are so wholly inadequate that they're reflecting a government whose agenda is so lacking in ambition, so lacking in content, so lacking in creativity, that it is simply not good enough for a country that is facing a whole raft of long-term challenges. So this is one of them. This is a first-order issue, as I have mentioned. This is a first-order issue for the federal government because our tax base is under threat, and we need a whole-of-government, comprehensive strategy for dealing with this issue, not a hollow government entity that is spending its money on advertising, but a long-term strategy where our tax base can be protected. But as I said, this bill is also symptomatic of this government's overall agenda. So yes, we don't oppose this bill. And as with other bills that have gone through this place over recent sitting weeks, we haven't opposed a number of those bills, but it's with a degree of regret at the lost opportunity that time after time after time we're seeing bills debated where the content of the bill only constitutes a few minutes of most speakers' speeches, and then the rest of their speeches are devoted to the weighty matters that we should be considering in bills, far thicker bills that we should be considering, but unfortunately, because of this government's inactivity, we're not. And as I said earlier, it's all the more inadequate given the fact that this is a third-term government. It's not like they haven't had time. They've had 7 years now to develop a full agenda on this issue. Where is it? And on issue after issue, 7 inert, 7 wasted years are being reflected in these bills that come here and that are wholly inadequate. So, yes, we'll support this bill. It's a step in the right direction, but this is a massive issue that deserves so much more. And then finally, on the amendment, as the Shadow Assistant Treasurer alludes to, this issue of moving to 12% is in and of itself a first-order issue, and it is critical that this parliament gets behind the increase to 12%, because in a society where people are living longer and longer, in a society where people are under increasing financial stresses, it is absolutely imperative that we put in place a regulatory environment where people's living standards in retirement are protected. And as a number of commentators have suggested, we are now probably entering a period where interest rates are going to be at historic lows for a very long time. We are seeing central banks around the world foreshadowing historic low interest rates for years. And of course this is going to have an impact on returns right up and down the risk schedule. So we can't make assumptions about equity returns. We can't make assumptions about the returns of asset classes that perhaps we could have a decade or two ago. That's why it's critical that this government puts into place a long-term strategy that protects people's retirement and income, given that many people who are investing now may face, in retirements that are longer than ever, very low returns in the lead-up to their retirement and during their retirement. So it is absolutely critical that in that environment we increase the rate of saving from 9.5% to 12%. Now, this should have been done long ago, but now it is absolutely imperative. So it is critical that we not only pass this bill, but that we pass the amendment to it so that we provide a signal to the sector that the promises that all the major parties took to the last election are going to be fulfilled. So, in conclusion, this is yet another bill that will get through this place, but it's yet another bill that reflects a missed opportunity.
I thank the member for Fraser for his contribution. The question now is that the amendment be agreed to, and I call the member for McKellar.
Madam Deputy Speaker, I will not detain the House long. I found the member for Fraser's speech both compelling and interesting. I would argue that the Smithsonian—
Order. The member for McKellar will resume his seat. The member for Whitlam— Scullin, I apologise.
Your attention to the state of the House, and I'm sure other members would like to hear from the member from McKellar.
Quorum required. Ring the bells for 4 minutes.
You owe me.
I was going to take an intervention and ask him if he could finish his time.
quorum present, I call the member for McKellar.
Recommend the bill to the House and hope that it passes it unamended.
I thank the member for McKellar for his contribution. The question now is that the amendment be agreed to, and I call the member for Scullin.
Thank you very much, Deputy Speaker. I'm pleased to make a few brief remarks to the bill and in support particularly and specifically of the amendment moved by the Shadow Assistant Treasurer, the member for Whitlam. The amendment really goes to the heart of a really important debate, important at two levels. It's important in terms of, obviously, its economic impact, in terms of supporting our superannuation system and supporting the retirement income of Australian workers. But as the member for Whitlam made clear in his contribution, it also goes fundamentally to the question of trust, which has been eroded in this place. So the second reading amendment gives members opposite an opportunity to put their vote in this place in accordance with the promises they made to the Australian people at the last election. I am pleased, though, that this bill has been brought on for debate, and I hope, Deputy Speaker, it was brought on following the debate that we had in this place over the proposal that this debate be postponed. Of course, the debate should not have been postponed. Of course, we should have brought it on. We have seen this week in this chamber a very, very thin legislative agenda, even by the standards of this government. This is a government without a plan, but fundamentally a government without a program. The parliament is sitting 4 out of 5 weeks at the moment, and yet the legislative agenda barely would suffice for one sitting week, barely for one. This is a government with no plan for the Australian economy, which is evidenced by how slowly this has moved. And that's why it was so concerning that it was proposed that this bill, this modest but not insignificant reform, was not to be proceeded with. It was really concerning to members on this side, and I think we heard a very effective contribution from the Manager of Opposition Business, who put very clearly before the House, and I'm pleased the Minister formerly at the table was persuaded by that contribution, that we should have this debate now. There are 13 billion reasons why we should have this debate now. 13 billion reasons. All of us in this place know that we have to take our obligations to secure revenue to fund the business of government very seriously. And I'm very pleased the Shadow Assistant Treasurer is here, because he has been leading this debate in this place. For 7 years this government has been asleep at the wheel. When the former government was in power, the former member for Lindsay, the former Assistant Treasurer, led the way and continues to lead the way internationally on these critical questions, making sure that we take seriously those companies that are not contributing to Australia, those companies which are abusing their social licence to operate without contributing to our Commonwealth. We know there are significant revenue pressures. We know on this side of the House there are things that government could and should be doing. These require revenue. And they also require us to look very, very seriously at those who are not paying the tax that they should be paying. Now, if the Minister thinks that's not the case, he will have an opportunity to contribute to this debate. Again, there are 13 billion reasons why we should be proceeding with this legislation now. $13 billion that should come into our revenue, that should be put to good use. And fundamentally, of course, this is a moral question at two levels. In terms of the bill itself, moving one step further towards cracking down on tax avoidance. That's a good thing. It's a good moral thing as well as a good economic thing. But also, in terms of the second reading amendment, Deputy Speaker, this gives government members an opportunity to be true to the commitments they made to their electorates at the last election. I urge every government member to support the second reading amendment and to progress with the legislation.
I thank the member for Scullin for his contribution. The question now is that the amendment be agreed to, and I call the member for Kingsford Smith.
Thank you, Deputy Speaker. I'm of course supporting the very sensible amendment that's been moved by the member for Whitlam, which criticises this government's approach to multinational tax transparency and also calls on the government to commit to the staged increase in superannuation that is vitally important, particularly for low-paid workers in this country. In terms of this bill, we're supporting the substantive of the bill, and Schedule 1 relates to significant global entities and expands the definition of a significant global entity in the Income Tax Assessment Act. This will expand reporting requirements to ensure that certain entities are currently not captured by the definition are covered by certain reporting requirements and other multinational tax avoidance laws. But it also modifies the rules around country-by-country reporting to ensure Australia complies with Australia's international commitments as part of the OECD's Base Erosion and Profit Shifting Action Plan. And there's been a lot of attention internationally recently about the BEPS program and ensuring that we're doing all we can to provide as much data as possible to crack down on tax avoidance through international channels. And the OECD has set up a process that Australia has signed up to that requires us to meet certain commitments in terms of legislative frameworks to ensure that we participate in those international strategies, and this bill achieves that. So Labor supports the measures extending the definition of global entities and moving to meet our international commitments. But we believe that this measure simply doesn't go far enough. The government's still letting a large number of multinational corporations get away with paying too little tax and get away with not disclosing that to the Australian people. Data that's been issued by the Australian Tax Office shows that 710 out of the 2,214 companies examined failed to pay any tax in the 2017-18 tax year. And the companies that paid no tax included 102 companies that were reporting more than $1 billion in total income. Now, for most Australians, that is inconceivable, that a company can have $1 billion in income in a particular year yet pay no tax to support social security and other programs throughout this country, particularly when they're deriving that profit and that income from their operations in Australia. Now, of course, we understand there are certain rules related to deductions and the ability to use those deductions, particularly capital outlays for major projects, to use those as deductions. But it's quite evident when you look at the tax transparency data and when you look at the information that's supplied by some of these companies about their operations in Australia, there's more to it than that. And a lot of them are using tax havens in other countries, by offering loans to subsidiaries, by moving income into other jurisdictions to avoid paying tax, corporate tax, here in Australia. And that's simply not good enough. It's certainly not being a good corporate citizen. It doesn't meet the expectations of the Australian people. And in many respects, they're letting their own employees down, their Australian employees, who rely on taxation revenue to fund important social services, the roads that they drive on to get to work in the morning, the parks that their kids enjoy to play sports on weekends, and other important infrastructure that's funded through our taxation system. While the average Australian worker pays 25% of their income in tax, large corporate entities and companies owning over $1 billion average tax payments of only 2% of total income. So clearly there's an imbalance there in the way the taxation system is working. And now the only reason we know a lot about this is that one-third of large companies that we know that one-third of large companies failed to pay any tax is because of the rules and the laws that Labor put in place when we were in government, that passed the parliament in 2013 about tax transparency and requiring those larger Australian corporations to report on an annual basis the amount of tax that they're actually paying. I think it's worth noting, Deputy Speaker, that those opposite opposed that legislation. They opposed that legislation around tax transparency and allowing the Australian public to know exactly what's going on when it comes to the amount of tax that's being paid by large corporate entities in this company. And worse still, Deputy Speaker, not only do they oppose it when they were in opposition, but once the legislation was brought in by the Labor Party in government, they then sought about undermining it and watering it down. And they were successful in doing that because, guess what, they teamed up with the Greens. They're often criticising the Greens, but when it comes to political expediency, they'll jump into bed with the Greens at the flash of a hat just to make sure that they get what they want. And that's what they did here. They jumped into bed with the Greens to water down tax transparency laws in this country. And shame on those opposite, because all it's meant is that the Australian people, Australia's hard-working taxpayers, don't know what's going on in a large number of corporations, because those large corporations aren't required to report their revenue and their taxation obligations under that Act. And this is after they voted against Labor's 2012 tax laws, which were directly responsible for BHP being forced to pay a $529 million tax bill in 2018. Now think about all of the services that $529 million funds for Australians. Yet those opposite voted against some of those laws that required those large corporations to pay those bills. The Coalition is failing small businesses and Australian workers who are struggling to compete, while international companies get away with paying very little or no tax at all. We need a government that gets serious about multinational tax and giving concessions to multinationals and focus on ensuring that money made in Australia isn't siphoned off overseas. Now, the other aspect of this bill that I'd like to comment on, Speaker, is Schedule 2, permanent tax relief for emerging superannuation funds. That amends various acts to make permanent certain forms of tax relief for emerging superannuation funds that are currently temporary. The temporary tax relief measures were originally introduced by Labor in 2008 to help with superannuation and its efficiency, and making those concessions permanent was a recommendation of the Productivity Commission in their 2019 report into superannuation. And this measure will make mergers between superannuation funds simpler, and Labor supports extending tax relief for merging superannuation funds, and expanding will give fund trustees certainty when planning merger activity and will provide wider benefits to fund members and the superannuation system through increased fund scale and efficiencies. We're also calling on the government to give members and trustees certainty about their retirement incomes into the future by meeting their commitment and by meeting the legislation to increase the superannuation guarantee to 12%. Labor has a very proud track record of boosting the compulsory retirement savings of workers in this country, particularly low-income workers who would retire without adequate retirement incomes to fund their retirement if it weren't for the reforms that were introduced by Labor and Labor's commitment to increasing that compulsory rate of superannuation to ensure that retirement incomes keep pace with the cost of living and the cost of increasing incomes in the rest of the economy. And we all know that there is a rabble and a group within the Coalition that have sought at every occasion to undermine that compulsory increase in superannuation savings. It will result in workers retiring with less in their superannuation balances, particularly low-paid workers and those that take breaks from the workforce, which unfortunately are typically women in Australia. So what they're trying to do is undermine the retirement incomes of low-paid workers and women in this country. And for us on this side, that's not on. That's not on, Deputy Speaker, because it means that ultimately those people retire with inadequate balances in their superannuation funds, and they have to rely on the age pension to get by into the future to a greater degree than they otherwise would have. And now that puts an impost on the Australian budget moving into the future, and of course means that it's harder for us to fund the necessary social services and other programs, particularly things like infrastructure programs, to grow our economy. Their fighting continues within the government between members and senators who like to attack the superannuation system and its key pillars, particularly a pillar like this. But this is more than a few rogue backbenchers, Deputy Speaker. It's a reflection of the Liberal Party's ideology, in that they've always been opposed to the notion of universal superannuation, and the Retirement Income Review should not be used as a stalking horse for further delays of the legislated increase to 12%. Too many Australians retire without adequate income savings, which is why our super system needs to be strengthened and protected, not undermined by the Coalition. And Labor, of course, is committed to the legislated superannuation guarantee rise, and we call on the government to do the same, to provide that certainty for Australian workers, that legislated increase, particularly in this time of anxiety and uncertainty about the government's track record on economic management, particularly in the context of a slowing economy, that they provide that guarantee of those compulsory increases into the future. Now, the original timetable has already been delayed. It's been delayed twice, costing workers who are retiring today between $60,000 and $100,000 in their superannuation balance. And freezing the legislated increase won't lead to pay rises, as those opposite have sought to argue. Our world-class super system means that we have a $3 trillion pool of savings, and this not only creates a retirement nest egg for Australians, it's being invested in infrastructure and businesses which are generating wealth, creating jobs and ensuring Australians own more of their economic activity in this country. So in conclusion, Deputy Speaker, we support these measures. In our view, they don't go far enough, particularly the measures related to tax transparency and laws in respect of that. And again, we call on the government to make sure that they meet their commitments to Australians when it comes to increasing compulsory retirement savings through the legislated increase in the superannuation guarantee.
I thank the member for Kingsford Smith for his contribution. The question now is that the amendment be agreed to, and I call the member for Fenner.
Thank you, Deputy Speaker. The problem of multinational profit shifting is a massive one. Globally, it's been estimated that some $600 billion of profits are shifted to tax havens. That is around 2/5 of all multinational profits being shifted to tax havens. Tax havens affect Australia's tax base. They siphon taxable profits away from jurisdictions like Australia, and the effect is that Australians either have to pay higher personal income taxes or else suffer from the lower quality of services. Tax havens aren't always illegal, but they're frequently immoral. And the users of tax havens include an awful lot of crooks. Tax havens are used by the North Korean regime for money laundering. They're used by extortionists. They're used by drug runners. Mexican drug cartels have been known to stash money in tax havens. So if you're operating out of a tax haven, you're likely rubbing shoulders with some pretty unsavoury characters. And aggressive tax planning erodes public confidence in the tax system. When taxpayers see others getting away by minimising their tax through the aggressive use of tax havens, then they're less likely to do the right thing. One of the reasons that we have relatively good tax compliance in Australia is a notion that people are playing by the rules. As that starts to break down, the tax base is at threat. Gabriel Zucman, an economist at the University of California, Berkeley, has estimated that around 4/5 of the money in offshore bank accounts is there in breach of other countries' tax laws. Counterfeiters, those using forced labour, al-Qaeda financiers have even routed their payments through tax havens. It's even been estimated that there are environmental vandals in tax havens. Following the Panama Papers, a study in the journal Nature, Ecology and Evolution found that 70% of fishing vessels implicated in illegal, unreported and unregulated catches had at some point been registered in a jurisdiction like Panama or Belize. Tax havens increase inequality. Offshore wealth held by Australians in tax havens has been estimated at 6% of GDP, according to Gabriel Zucman's work from 2013. Update that to the present day, it would mean that over $100 billion of Australians' assets were currently sitting in tax havens. And this is money not just of the wealthy, but of the super wealthy. One study which matched data from high-profile leaks to tax statistics estimated half the money in tax havens was held by the top 1/10,000th of the population. We're not talking about the 1%, we're not talking about the 0.1%. We are talking about the top 0.01%, holding half the wealth in tax havens. And that makes sense when you know about the sort of vehicles we're considering. If you need a minimum $1 million investment, you'll need to be a multimillionaire to be investing in these sorts of vehicles. When you take offshore wealth into account, estimates of inequality turn out to be a whole lot higher. And the residents of tax havens themselves don't necessarily benefit from these arrangements. So if you take a country like Bermuda or the British Virgin Islands, many of the citizens live in poverty. It's akin to the resource curse. People have talked about the finance curse, where places like Bermuda fail to see the benefits for their citizens from being a tax haven. The International Monetary Fund has found that these sorts of negative spillovers can particularly hurt developing countries. And I'd commend to the House an important initiative that the OECD has been pursuing, Tax Inspectors Without Borders. Modelled on the much better-known Doctors Without Borders, Médecins Sans Frontières, Tax Inspectors Without Borders is a joint initiative of the OECD and the UN Development Project, working in countries in Africa, Asia, Latin America and the Caribbean. It sees tax inspectors work alongside finance ministries in those countries to get the tax that's appropriately due to the residents of that country. Bless you, Minister. And it's been estimated that for every dollar spent on tax inspectors without borders, there's an additional $100 in revenue to those developing countries. That is an extraordinary payback. I'd encourage the government, through its foreign aid program, limited as it now is, to consider investing more Australian resources in tax inspectors without borders. It would be an appropriate thing for the government to do in order to deal with some of these challenges that tax havens pose to those in developing countries. Tax havens should be a top priority for this government. Since 2013, there's been a joint initiative of the OECD and the G20 called the Base Erosion and Profit Shifting Project. Australia used to be on the steering committee for that. We no longer are. We've stepped from the front seat into the back seat. That's a pity, because it means that we're unable to influence this important conversation and to be leaders on multinational tax avoidance, as occurred during Labor's last term in office. We were at the vanguard of pushing some of these important measures, but since the coalition's come to office, Australia has been a laggard on dealing with multinational tax avoidance. The coalition promised to put in place a register of beneficial ownership and then backflipped, killed the idea. They voted against Labor's measures to close multinational tax loopholes when they were in office, and then, despite us supporting their multinational anti-avoidance law, set about lying to the Australian people, suggesting that Labor had not supported that law. It's simply not true. Labor has supported the modest multinational tax avoidance measures the coalition's put in place, but we would like to see them go further. An estimate from Gabrielle Zucman and co-authors is that up to $16 billion of additional revenue could be flowing to tax havens as a result of the failure to properly crack down on tax havens. Other countries are looking at alternatives such as digital taxation. Other countries are moving more quickly on the public reporting of country-by-country reports. Other countries have better registers of beneficial ownership, providing accurate information as to who really owns Australians' firms. Other countries have whistleblower protection laws, qui tam laws, which have been in place in Britain and the United States for many years. They have better rules around government tenders, ensuring those who are tendering for government contracts disclose their country of tax domicile. And other countries have significantly greater tax transparency than Australia does. As the member for Kingsford Smith pointed out earlier, Labor's laws, which would have seen reporting of taxable income and tax paid by firms over $100 million, were wound back by the Coalition One office and a dodgy deal with the Australian Greens. That meant that 2/3 of the private firms were taken out of the tax transparency net when the threshold went from $100 million to $200 million. We were told before those laws came into place that they would create a kidnap risk a variety of questionable excuses were used. I've seen no evidence since those laws came into effect that any of those scare campaigns were anything other than vested interests trying to look after their mates. So it would be perfectly appropriate in an era in which Australians are hankering after more tax transparency for this information to be expanded, for the threshold to be brought down from $200 million to $100 million. This tax transparency information has taught Australians the true extent of tax paid in Australia, and we can see a significant number of Australian firms, as the member for Whitlam has noted, not paying any tax, including some of Australia's largest firms. The Luxembourg leaks, the Panama Papers, the Banking Royal Commission should have taught us that tax transparency is of the utmost importance. That if you're going to have faith in the system, you need significant expansion of tax transparency. The coalition has misstated to the Australian people its own tax record on tax transparency. The moment of greatest chutzpah came when the Prime Minister tried to claim credit for a $300 million tax judgment against Chevron, despite the fact that that judgment was only allowed because of Labor's laws, which he had voted against. He and his colleagues voted against closing a multinational tax avoidance loophole, which was then used to add $300 million to the budget bottom line, and he patted himself on the back for it. Really, what he should have done is go to the Australian people and say, "I'm sorry, I got it wrong." Frankly, the Prime Minister should be saying he's sorry a whole lot more often, on everything from sports rorts to the fact that people can't buy those back-in-black coffee mugs from the Liberal Party website any longer. But he's not really one for apologies, the Prime Minister, and he wasn't one for apologising for having wrongly voted against Labor's measures to close multinational tax avoidance loopholes. We've seen from the coalition advertisements patting themselves on the back for getting tough on multinational tax avoidance, while at the same time slashing compliance staff in the tax office. The tax office has lost some 4,000 staff since the coalition came to office in 2013. It has lost a huge number of its staff, and the coalition are then calling on the tax office, like they're calling on so many public service agencies, to do more with less. We know that when you cut tax office staff, you cut into the revenue base, because the projections from additional tax office staff is that they more than pay for themselves in ensuring that multinational companies do the right thing. We have, from the coalition, a government which is much more a mateocracy than a meritocracy, which is looking after multinational tax avoidance loopholes. I've heard the Treasurer going to— oh, I'll take that interjection from the Minister. The Minister needs to turn to the Hansard.
Order. The Minister,
and the Minister needs to turn to the Hansard and refresh himself with the fact that Labor never voted against the Coalition's multinational anti-avoidance law. It is simply a lie put about by the Liberal Party to try and distract from the fact that they indeed did vote against Labor's loophole closing. They claimed wrongly that our loophole closing was retrospective. We said that their laws were inadequate, but we would vote for them all the same because modest measures were better than nothing. But we've seen from the Treasurer, when he had his former resources portfolio, speeches to large mining conferences in which he proudly said to the multinational firms there that he was opposed to closing multinational tax loopholes, that he would fight to keep those loopholes open. So when they're with their well-connected insiders, they're always happy to fight for loopholes. When they're advertising to the Australian people, they pretend they're serious about tax havens. They simply are not.
It being 7:30 p.m, I propose the question that the House do now adjourn, and I call the member for Corangamite.
Thank you, Deputy Speaker. I want to speak about two fabulous caring organisations on the Bellarine Peninsula in my seat of Corangamite. Both are great examples of the power of solidarity when committed individuals contribute their time, their skills and resources to the benefit of their community. There has been a lot of talk about grants in this House in recent weeks, and shamefully the selection processes around some of these grants, sports, water safety and congestion, have been woeful and unfair. However, some grants, like the Community Support Program and the Volunteers grants, give local members of parliament a chance to recognise the enormous good that many organisations do. The two organisations I refer to are recipients of a recent grant, and deservedly so. The first organisation is Compassionate Hearts on the Bellarine. Compassionate Hearts has been operating since April last year and provides support to people who have a life-limiting illness and their carers, supplementing their usual palliative care or other services. They provide practical support, visits, meals, reading or a helping hand to get to services. In addition, they provide community education around grief, illness, dying and loss. The ethos of Compassionate Hearts is about better living and a good death. It was the idea of Chair Pauline Noonan, palliative care physician Dr David Brumley and Dr Kate Jackson. It has a committee of 9 plus 12 trained volunteers, including volunteer coordinator Anne Matheson. Compassionate Hearts currently cares for about 9 patients and takes referrals from Bellarine Health. I was pleased to be able to provide this amazing service with $2,500 from my electorate allowance last year and have recommended Compassionate Hearts for a volunteer grant this year. I urge anyone interested in doing this important work to get in touch with Compassionate Hearts through their website. The second organisation is Feed Me Bellarine, an exciting community-driven food-sharing program based in Ocean Grove that is feeding vulnerable families across the Bellarine. While unemployment across Corangamite is relatively low at 3%, there are large pockets of underemployment, and I was shocked to find some very low household incomes in some areas of the Bellarine in a map provided to me by the Parliamentary Library last year. Feed Me Bellarine has been operating for about 2 years and is the brainchild of Lana Purcell, owner of Belly Bowls and Bellarine Catering, and Chef Anthony Woodbury. The pair are working on saving food waste from 2 commercial food stores and other commercial cafes, restaurants and food producers, and share with the community members who need it the most. They now have a team of over 80 dedicated volunteers. They have some support from the Freemasons and other organisations who've kindly donated money to buy a food rescue truck to service the area. I know when I visited Lonsdale Hydroponic Tomatoes last year and mentioned Feed Me Bellarine, they got involved and are now supplying Seconds tomatoes of a very high quality as part of the program. Thank you to them and many other food producers for playing their part. Many new links and referrals are happening as the service grows. Currently, the program provides around 250 meals a day. Many people in our community are concerned about waste. Lana told the Bellarine Times last year, "I've been catering for about 5 years now, and because we do bulk catering, we have a lot of food left over. So what we were doing internally was packaging up and giving it to staff and anyone we knew who was struggling at the time. But when Anthony came on board, he pushed for us to feed more people. Lana and Anthony, who have been both experienced hard times throughout their lives, stressed that Feed Me Bellarine is not church-based or funded and have created the concept, no question and no agendas. We have no connection with anything and just want to help. Everyone needs a hand up now and then. I urge any restaurant or food producer in the Bellarine or Surf Coast to contact Lana through the Feed Me Bellarine website if you can help. I certainly will be doing all I can to help this fantastic social enterprise to grow, including recommending them for a volunteer grant in the recent round. These fantastic organisations are just two of the reasons that make living on the Bellarine so special. There are many more organisations like them, and I thank each and every one of them for the contribution
The member's
they make.
time has expired. I call the member for North Sydney.
Thank you, Mr Deputy Speaker. This evening I rise to reflect on what I believe is one of the most important statutory bodies established by the Commonwealth Government and the Australian Parliament, and I refer to the Sydney Harbour Federation Trust. I say that it is one of the most important because this trust, established almost 20 years ago in legislative form in 2001, has the incredible responsibility of preserving, protecting and ensuring public accessibility in the hands of Australians in perpetuity to some of the most important local, national and international sites in Australia, and I refer to those sites that it manages around Sydney Harbour. I want to make these reflections tonight because the government has established a review after 20 years of the functioning of the trust, and it is important, as a local member that includes 2 of the trust sites, that I set out some of my own views. Firstly, I want to say I think that the trust as it is currently formed has done an outstanding job in managing the sites that it has responsibility for. From its first chair, Kevin McCann, through to the current chair, Joseph Carosi, with the incredible staff that it's had, particularly its inaugural Executive Director, Jeff Bailey, and his team, including Nick Hollow, it has made sure that these jewels on Sydney Harbour have been protected in the way that was intended by the Howard government at the time. I do want to reflect briefly on its history, because this trust, this legislation came about through community action. It came about by concerned citizens that wanted to see Sydney Harbour's foreshores protected as they should be. It came about because of the actions of dedicated local residents, people like Kevin McCann, Linda Bergen, Peter Lowry, Barry O'Keefe, who fought Kim Beazley's proposals to sell off part of HMAS Penguin for housing, people like Don Goodsir, the late Don Goodsir, who was such a driving force. And they came together, and with the support of then Prime Minister John Howard, in what I regard to be one of his most significant legacies for the City of Sydney, determined that these former defence lands should be protected in perpetuity in the ownership of Australians, and established a trust to achieve those goals. The trust was established in 1998, and I remember it well personally because at the time I was a very much younger advisor to the Environment Minister and had a hand in the drafting of our election policies and the legislation that followed. But at the time, John Howard, when he announced the trust, said on the 5th of September 1998 that, and I quote, "I'm particularly proud of this announcement as a person who has lived all of his life in Sydney. Like any other Australian, I'm immensely proud of the beauty of the City of Sydney. I'm immensely proud of the foreshores of Sydney Harbour. It is an asset that belongs to all of the Australian people." The trust has been vested with a number of sites over the years, including Subbase Platypus in my own electorate and also the Woolwich Stocks, which are also in my electorate. It has been a model for the management of these sites under the visionary leadership of those who have led it. Since then, we have had calls for a review which have been acted upon by the Environment Minister, and the review is currently being undertaken by the former Secretary of Planning for New South Wales, Carolyn McNally, together with former Executive Director of Infrastructure New South Wales, Erin Flattery. I wanted to say a few things about the direction of that review. Firstly, I want to say that I hope that that review finds that the concept of this trust, that these lands should remain in the ownership of the Australian people for all times under the care of the Commonwealth Government, should remain its driving principle. And that trust must remain the manager and the controller of these sites. I also want to say that the trust currently has a sunset clause of 2033. My strong view is that that sunset clause should be lifted. These sites should remain in the hands of the Commonwealth and not be transferred to either state or local government agencies. Thirdly, I want to say that the management of these sites must remain in the hands of the trust. While some of these sites are leased to other users to make sure that their old buildings are adapted appropriately, management control on behalf of the Australian people must remain with the trust. Finally, I also want to emphasise the fact that whatever emerges from this review, I think it is absolutely essential that the trust continue to ensure that not only the natural environment but the built heritage of these sites is protected. I know there is some concern that some of these sites could be redeveloped. I think that is misplaced. because the heritage of these sites is just so valuable. These are precious assets which we are custodians of on behalf of the Australian people, and long may that continue.
I call the member for Franklin.
Thank you, Deputy Speaker. And last week, like many people I'm sure in this place, I got a chance to get out and about in my electorate and to visit many of those wonderful community groups doing great things in local communities. In particular, I was pleased to be able to visit some of those organisations that have received some funding under some recent grant rounds, Deputy Speaker. One of those was the Clarendon Vale Neighbourhood Centre that received a grant for $7,800 to assist the centre in purchasing solar panels for its roof. It was particularly pleasing to see and hear the impact that these solar panels will have on the centre's resources. In particular, the savings that they make on their energy bills will allow them to provide more support to their local community. The Clarendon Vale Neighbourhood Centre is essentially social development in action, Deputy Speaker. It's a wonderful place to go and visit. There's always lots and lots of community members. They have a dinner there that they do regularly on Thursday, I think it is, and over 80 people have been turning up from the local community to go to this neighbourhood house for these wonderful meals, and local community members come and volunteer in this centre all the time. So it was wonderful to see them receiving this grant funding. Another one was actually one of my councillors at Kingborough Council who received $20,000 through the Communities Environments program, and that was to essentially work on a major restoration project around the salt marshes on the Browns River. This is an area that you wouldn't know was there unless you're a regular local walking around near the river as it meets the beach. It's fabulous to see what the vision for this area is, eventually for Council to put boardwalks on and to connect it up to some of the other features in the Kingston area that Council has been working on. I was also privileged to go and visit the Dover District School, who received some money through the schools funding program. They got $20,000, and the principal there, Mr Eastland, known as Mr E to the students, gave me a tour of the school and showed me the science lab where this money is supposed to be spent and is desperate for an upgrade, Deputy Speaker. Here we have students in a district school over an hour south of Hobart without a lot of resources who really need this in their local school. So it was wonderful to be able to talk to the principal but also some of the students and teachers about the needs of that local school. One of the other things that I really enjoyed was being with Senator Katrina Bilyk and our upper house candidate for the seat of Huon Bastion Sidel. People may remember Bastion's name. He used to be head of the GP College, Deputy Speaker, and he is standing for Labor in a local upper house election to be held on the 2nd of May. And one of the fun things we did was go to one of the local Catholic schools that is in the Huon electorate with Katrina Bilyk and Bastion to see them receive a grant for $11,000, but to see the plans for these cricket nets, and to talk particularly to the young girls at this school who are taking up cricket. I said to them that this year, for the first time, when I've been doing school assemblies, I've seen young women in grade 6 aspire to be a full-time cricketer, Deputy Speaker. That is the first time after 12 years in this place where I've seen young girls actually aspire to be a cricketer full-time in Australia and play for Australia. And I was so proud to be able to fund these cricket nets that I know that these young women are going to be able to enjoy in my local community. As we've heard a lot in this place, Deputy Speaker, there is a huge demand for facilities for females as females take up what are traditional sports, male sports, Deputy Speaker, the AFL, rugby, a whole range of things. But of course we've seen that many community organisations haven't been able to access their fair share of those because of some of the rorting that went on under the current government in the last grants rounds. But I was very pleased to be able to tell my community that they have my support, they have Labor's support to be able to invest in local facilities in their local communities. But I was particularly pleased to be able to talk to these girls about their aspirations and for these cricket nets to be opened up not just at the school but for the whole local community, Deputy Speaker. So it was wonderful to be able to do that. Whilst I've got a few minutes, I do want to thank the local community members who have been part of these grants round process. They put a lot of time and energy into shortlisting the grants rounds and going through all the applications and making recommendations for funding. I particularly want to thank Anne Harrison, Michael Higgins, Charles Rich and Peter Shelley for their assistance in the Stronger Communities program and the Communities Environment program, and I want to thank Perpetua Turner, Juliana Scher and Nigel Jones for the schools program. Deputy Speaker.
I call the member for Robertson.
Thank you, Deputy Speaker. Following Clean Up Australia Day on Sunday and our first National Plastic Summit held in Canberra this week, I'd like to reflect on some of the great work being done both nationally and in my electorate of Robertson to encourage recycling and help close the loop on plastics. Deputy Speaker, I'm proud to be part of a government which is driving Australia's waste recycling industry forward by investing almost $20 million in a series of initiatives that will create new jobs, grow our economy and help our environment. The global recycled plastics market is expected to grow at 7.9% annually over the next decade and be worth almost $67 billion in 2025. Our capacity for job creation is significant, with investment in the recycling industry. For every 10,000 tonnes of waste sent to landfill, around 3 direct jobs are created. But if we recycle the same waste, we can create approximately 9 jobs directly. I'm so pleased that recycling and our use of plastics are a topic of strong national focus, with Monday's inaugural National Plastic Summit a very clear example, and it was really encouraging to hear that more than 200 representatives from industry, government, schools and community came together to discuss ways to reduce plastic waste and increase recycling. One of the key industry pledges made during the summit on Monday was Pact Group's $500 million investment in sustainable packaging, reuse and recycling initiatives. Sulo, a subsidiary of Pact Group, has a manufacturing plant located in Summersby in my electorate of Robertson, and this plant is best known for manufacturing plastic wheelie bins, which are used in homes right across the country to help support recycling. Sulo is already using 40% recycled material to manufacture these wheelie bins, and it was fantastic to hear on Monday that Pact Group have set a goal to increase this to 80% by 2025, so I commend Pact Group for playing their part in closing the loop on plastics. Local primary school students from the Central Coast are also doing their bit, joining Central Coast Council's pilot program with Plastic Police to help build roads out of soft plastics. Streets outside St Patrick's Catholic Primary School in East Gosford and Budgeroi Public School were recently renewed using the road resurfacing product Reconophalt, with students contributing plastic waste from their lunchboxes and classrooms. A total of 4 Central Coast roads have been upgraded, with the road base, Melbourne Street in East Gosford alone, utilising more than 300,000 plastic bags, 56,000 glass bottles and toner from almost 7,000 used printer cartridges. Living in a community with many beaches, Deputy Speaker, I'm too often reminded of the devastating impact plastic has on our oceans and sea life. Sadly, every year 8 million tonnes of plastic ends up in our oceans. Thankfully, the Central Coast has got a number of local organisations working hard to reduce the amount of plastic ending up in our waterways and harming our marine life. For example, the Central Coast not-for-profit Clean for Shore has spent the last decade collecting hundreds of tonnes of plastic from our waterways and wetlands. Graham, or Jono as he's well known, Graham Johnston's award-winning program partners with schools, youth and social services organisations and businesses to clean up marine debris. Clean for Shore conducts approximately 110 field trips a year in a number of waterways right across the Central Coast. And on Clean Up Australia Day, Jono ran a field trip with the Gosford Girl Guides in Brisbane Water, where they managed to collect 20 bags of waste, mainly soft plastic and food wrappings. The total waste dropped to the tip after the field trip was a massive 180 kilograms. The federal government has been able to help continue funding the important work of Clean for Shore by committing $300,000 under the Environment Restoration Fund. Another local Central Coast-based initiative is Take 3 for the Sea, a local organisation leading the world in taking action on plastic pollution and waste. Their premise is simple and effective. Ask anyone who visits a beach or waterway to pick up 3 pieces of rubbish. And in 10 years, the Take 3 for the Sea community has expanded to over 300,000 people in 129 countries. I take this opportunity to recognise the work of co-founder Tim Silverwood, who is stepping down from the role of CEO to work as a Take 3 ambassador. The Take 3 initiative has grown significantly under his excellent leadership, and I look forward to working with his replacement, Sarah Beard. In closing, Deputy Speaker, Australia must invest in technology and innovation in the plastic recycling industry, and the Morrison government is leading the way to make this vision a reality. We've got an incredible opportunity to make plastic recycling a cornerstone of growing our economy and creating jobs while reducing our negative impact on the planet.
I call the member for Shortland.
Thank you, Mr Deputy Speaker. Unfortunately, I am again providing an update to the House on the ongoing crisis in aged care, in this instance residential home care packages. The provision of both residential and home care for the elderly is important for me, as I represent the 6th oldest electorate in the country, and my constituents are suffering because of the total failure of the government to respond to the crisis in aged care. The issue that I've been familiar with for many years is constituents being granted home care packages but being unable to find a service provider. Recently, my office has been contacted by constituents who have been contacted by the company who provide their home garden and maintenance assistance and told because they were oversubscribed that they will no longer be able to provide the service. They have referred them to other services who are also oversubscribed, which means they are being placed on a waiting list. These are elderly people and in many cases vulnerable people who have relied on a service, and because of the chronic underfunding of CHSP packages, particularly home care and maintenance and domestic assistance packages, are now without a service. Home care and maintenance for these constituents is often lawn mowing. They simply are not in a position to do this job, hence they qualify for the package. And now they have no one to mow their lawns, and this is causing them considerable distress. Mr Deputy Speaker, this issue has recently been brought to my attention by Lynn and Doug from Macquarie Hills. I know Doug because he's a veteran. I've met him several times at Cardiff RSL ceremonies. When Doug became unable to do the lawn, Lynn took over. Then, because of her arthritis, she couldn't continue, and they were fortunate to get a level 1 package for home care and maintenance, which covered the lawn mowing. Now this service has been suddenly taken away from them, and they are stranded on a waiting list with no one to do their lawns. Because of Lynn's arthritis and Doug's heart and diabetes issues, they can't mow the lawn, nor should they have to. It's just not right that in the 21st century Australia, elderly people who have contributed to our society for decades, in Doug's case serving in our Defence Force, are not getting basic yet important services, which help them to remain at home, or worse, they have them and they have their services unexpectedly stopped. In my time, I also want to raise the issue of the ongoing delays with the granting of home care packages. John at Elibarna has recently been in contact. John is the carer for his elderly wife, who sadly has dementia. John's wife is on a level 1 package but has been approved for a level 3 package, which they've been told by the service provider won't be available until early next year. This will be a wait of 2 years since she was approved for the level 3 package. John is a very elderly man and has explained the basic assistance he gets with a level 1 package and how exhausted he is attending to all the other caring work, which he should not have to do and wouldn't be doing if they were getting the care under a level 3 package. This is just another shocking example of elderly Australians not being provided the home care they are entitled to. I've written to the Minister and asked that urgent extra funding be provided for Commonwealth home support packages for the Hunter region. These home care issues are just another example of the government's complete neglect of aged care, and recently wanted to privatise the ACAT system, which is outrageous. It is literally the only part of the aged care system that is working, and this government tried to ruin it by privatising the ACAT system. I applaud the member for Monash, who has called out the government on this shameful attempt to again flog off essential services that are the duty of the state to provide, not the private sector at a bargain price. No doubt a company with links to the Liberal Party would have been interested in this tender, as is the case with the privatisation of the visa system, which is probably going to go to one of the Prime Minister's good mates, Scott Briggs, who made several large donations to the Liberal Party. This is endemic of the way this government operates, Mr Deputy Speaker. It is a government run by the Liberal Party for the benefit of the Liberal Party and their donors, and the home care system is another example of it. The government may, in the next budget, make more announcements about more home care packages, as they did in the last budget, but as in that case, Mr Speaker, Deputy Speaker, it didn't keep up with the growing demand for these packages. Home care packages provide dignity for elderly Australians and allows them to remain in their family home, which is important both for their retirement, for dignity in their retirement and comfort in their retirement, and is cheaper for the taxpayer. But the impact of underfunding and a lack of service providers is having a significant impact on my elderly constituents. Labor and I will continue to hold the government to account for their outrageous neglect of such an important group in our society. We have a compact with elderly Australians, Mr Deputy Speaker. They are entitled to a dignified retirement, a retirement where they are supported by the state. Unfortunately, this government is failing in that obligation.
I call the member for O'Connor.
Deputy Speaker, the live animal export industry and its supply chain supports many communities across my electorate of O'Connor. These communities supply over 65% of sheep exported from WA to the Middle East. In the past 2 years, industry has worked hard to improve their public image and increase transparency so they continue to supply quality Australian produce to our Middle Eastern markets. Recent changes to maximise animal welfare include reducing the mortality rate threshold to 1%, noting that recent mortalities have been as low as 0.1%. Using allometric stocking densities, providing up to 40% more space for sheep, independent verification of air turnover within pens, and independent observers on board all livestock export vessels at the exporter's expense. The 3-month disruption to the trade in 2018 was followed in 2019 with a moratorium over the northern summer, extended by 3 weeks to the 22nd of September. 2 years on, there has not been a single heat stress event, and industry continues to work towards upgrading their vessels and maximising animal welfare on board. Deputy Speaker, this has not been without considerable cost. The recently released Mercado report estimates $86.3 million was lost by the industry in 2018, equating to $37.6 million for farmers at the farm gate. And in 2019, the industry lost $65.8 million, with the farm gate cost being $29.6 million. These economic impacts flow through to industries like the livestock transport operators, who are average losses of 35 to 50%, with some single operators losing as much as 85%. Shearing services, where a full year's workload is condensed into an 8-month period. Fodder manufacturers, who rely on the live export trade for more than 90% of their revenue. And stock agents and sheep buyers, who are paid on commission. Vets, stock handlers, stevedores, shipping services and other port operators are also affected. Deputy Speaker, I'm pleased to report to the House that the shipping practices that have been put into place are having a very positive impact. In 2019, mortality rates were 54% below the historic season average from 2013 to 2017. Unfortunately, despite the willingness of industry to comply with regulation, there is a growing feeling of disconnect between industry and government. This is demonstrated in the latest shipment of 65,000 sheep which left from Fremantle to the Middle East by Rural Export and Trading WA. The Al Shuaik vessel was scheduled for decommissioning in line with the Australian Maritime Safety Authority phase-out of two-tier vessels by 2023. After the Awassi Express incident, this was brought forward to January 2020, leaving Retwa struggling to fill orders while retrofitting one vessel and acquiring a new vessel to meet compliance. Wetwa applied to AMSA in late 2019 in an effort to secure an exemption for the Al Shuaik in the interim. Retwa also submitted the requisite animal welfare plan to the Department of Agriculture in mid-December, which was approved on the 11th of February 2020. Exemption to the AMSA Marine Order 43 was ultimately granted on the 7th of February 2020, but excluded the only single-tier deck on the ship. The exporter and vessel owner had treated their exemption application as whole of ship, only to find their best ventilated single-tier deck had been excluded from carrying any livestock at all. Emergency communication was exchanged between myself and the Deputy Prime Minister's office on February the 18th. Despite a directive from the Deputy Prime Minister that AMSA urgently communicate with the exporter about this imminent shipment, they failed to contact Retwa. 1 week later, AMSA did make contact with the wrong shipping service. Meanwhile, the ship sailed 2 days later at 8 p.m. on February the 20th with no cattle or sheep on the best ventilated deck on the boat. 636 cattle and over 1,000 sheep were returned to the feedlot at a loss to the exporter of over $1 million. On the 21st of February, I wrote to Minister Littleproud citing the above as an example of the problems industry is having with the timely approval of paperwork critical to meeting their commitments to overseas markets. I conveyed that exporters perceived a serious disconnect between the Canberra-based regulator and the on-ground realities of the animal live export trade. I have requested Minister Littleproud reconsider locating senior regulatory staff to key live export ports as a logical step in the government's decentralisation agenda. My concerns extend to the whole live export supply chain, which starts in the farming communities of my electorate of O'Connor. I believe a better understanding of the on-ground challenges faced by exporters and those right down the supply chain will help the development and maintenance of a viable live animal export industry that is transparent and consistently demonstrates positive animal welfare outcomes. Thank you.
It being 8 p.m, the House stands adjourned until 9:30 a.m. tomorrow.